All right, we are all here. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Phil Ojevsky. I'm kind of the community outreach guy for Brim, and here we've got James with us, who is our lead UX developer, and he's going to kind of give us a walk through what is in the code. So folks that want to get started with doing their own enhancements or bug fixes, if you're up for it, know where all the stuff is buried. So yeah, I'm going to kind of keep this loose. I'm going to keep people, I'm not going to I'm not going to mute everybody. If you guys have questions, just speak up. If things get unruly or something, if there's too much background noise, I might have to mute people. But let's give this a shot. So I'll stop sharing and pass it over to James.
Sounds good. And I'm going to share my desktop. Yeah, and if any of y'all have any questions, feel free to interrupt me and ask as we're doing this. Okay, so I'm going to basically just go through this walkthrough document that's on the Brim wiki, and we'll just start at the entry point of the app. So Brim is an Electron app, and which means it's like it's a node package. So if we look in our package JSON, you've got all the standard stuff you'd see in here: the name, the repository, which version we're running, and then this main key is the main script to the application. And so it's in dist, and dist just means that we write code in src in the source folder, and then it automatically gets built into the dist folder, which is git ignored, I think, but I could see it here. So this just the dist folder mirrors exactly what's in source, but it's just compiled into like dumber JavaScript. We write it in fancy JavaScript, and it gets compiled down to simpler JavaScript for browsers and whatnot. Okay, so if we look in source.js Electron main, we'll see let's see, Electron and main. This is the first file that gets run when Brim starts up. And so I'll briefly talk about this Electron directory. In any Electron app, there's two main processes. There's two processes: the main process, which is like a node process, and then there's only one of those. And then you could have one or many renderer processes, which are a browser window, which are like Chromium. So the JavaScript runs in two contexts. It runs in a node process and in a Chromium process. And everything in this Electron folder is intended to be run in the node main process. So yeah, so when this main function finishes, it creates a browser window, and that's done in the window manager here, which is in this Tron, which is short for Electron, but that's just a place to put our own data structures. So the window manager, when it starts up, it opens this search window, and this the search window is, I don't know how detailed to go in this, but I guess I'll click into it if I can. Open window. Open window is here. This function, we set up a browser window in Electron and open it. And where is, I guess it's right here. So this window function. If it's a search, we open a search window, and then here's the Electron API that creates a browser window. You can give it a height, you can give it a min height, min width, whether it's resizable, and then which HTML file you want to load. So search HTML is at the root of the app. So we'll jump back up in here, and this is the page that the browser will load. So this is just HTML. And it's a fully single page app. There's no multiple HTML pages. It's just all handled in React, the whole app. So all we do is require this search JS script. And from there, React takes over the DOM and renders components and does its single page app thing. So I'll open up that now. src JS. This is where all the JavaScript for the whole app lives, in this src JS folder. And at the bottom here are a few just regular JavaScript files, and those are the entry points for each of the pages. In Brim, there's only three types of windows you can open. There's a search window, a detail window, and an about window. And I guess I could show you those in the actual Brim app. So this we would call the search window. And then if I load up some data and I double click on a log, this is called the detail window. And then in the Electron, or in the app menu, I can click About Brim, and this is the About window. So this is it. This is the only three windows that we have in the whole app. But as we add more windows, they'll just live right here. The entry points to those files will just live right here in the root of the JS folder. All right, so I'll just keep going here. I'll open up the main one, which is search.js, and we run this initialize function, which sets up everything we need to before we render any components, and then it resolves as a promise and gives us the Redux store. So in Electron, or in our app, we use Redux to store the application state. And down here in this document, I've got a list of, if I scroll down, here's a list of the libraries that we rely heavily on. And for the state management, this is Redux. So you can find a link to all the documentation there, getting started with Redux and whatnot, and then some other libraries. But yeah, as we're looking through, if I mention a library that you haven't heard of, this is the kind of list of the main ones with their doc links. Okay, so we are in search.js. We set up a Redux store, set up some other stuff in the initialize, and then we render this to the DOM. And so our app starts in this app component, and that would be in this components directory. So the components directory is every single component in the whole app just lives right in here. And it doesn't matter what page it's on or what window it belongs to, everything goes in here. And it's pretty flat. It's a pretty flat structure right now. I just started with putting every component at the top level, not adding any folders. And then as things got a little more complex, or as there were a lot of components that were just related to one thing, I might start making folders like this and storing a related group of components in there. And we recently started adding in this common folder, any components that are really reusable that we want to use, like forms, go in here. So there's like a text input form, a search input, or a select input, a label, a field, things like that. So we're going to start building that out a little bit more. Okay, so we're in the app component, which is right here, app.js. This is the once we're in here, now we're in the React world, and we've been using functional components Um, for the React side of things, we were using a lot of class component in the past, but then as soon as React introduced their hooks API, everything you used to be able to do in a class component, you can now do in a function component. And the ability to use these hooks are really cool. If you're not familiar with React hooks, they're like maybe 2 years old or a year and a half or something. And I also got a link to those in here. This React hooks doc is right here. And yeah, it's another way to add in behavior. So this use effect means like a side effect that's going to happen after this page renders, or after this component renders. We're going to invoke that, hey, this window is ready as a side effect. Yeah, let's see. There used to be this convention where I would put X in front of components if they connected to the Redux store, because Redux had an X in it. And so if it had an X at the beginning, it's connected to the Redux store. But that's an old pattern that we're not using anymore. Any of these can connect to the Redux store pretty easily now with the use of hooks. Yeah, let's see. Here's an example of getting some state. So we're setting the time zone for the app here in this first line. And we've got this use selector hook, which goes into the Redux store, and it selects the time zone. So here's a list of the, here's the directory structure. All the state in the app lives in, let's see, right now we're in components. I talked a little bit about Electron. The state directory is where all the getters and setters and actions are for the app. So this is looking in this view.getTimeZone means it's looking in the view slice of the state, and it's calling this getter function. And so let's go look at that. So we're going to come down here into state. And why don't I show you the root reducer? So this is the shape of the application state. Each key maps to its own slice. We call this like a slice. And so each of these reducers are called slice reducers. And each slice has its own folder also next to it here. So if I want to look at view, the view slice, I can go to the view folder and check it out. So let's do that. View. And what is view? What does this view mean? I think view is like, well, let's look at it. Let's look at the reducer. So here's the initial state that we give to this slice. Is the download page open? Okay. Are we on, what kind of tab are the results on? And then finally, are we using the time zone? Or what time zone are we using? We default to UTC. So I guess view is like what things are open and what things are closed. Although that's also done in some other places. So I think this reducer looks like it can go. It can probably be moved and refactored into other things, into another one of these that handles that, like layout. I think layout has a very similar responsibility. But anyway, for this, we've got the time zone stored in this view slice of the state. So all these directories look exactly the same, pretty much. They've got a reducer, selectors, actions. Those are kind of the three main ones. And then this index file just exports all of them: actions, selectors, reducers. We'll talk about flows in a minute. But here, so for the view, we've got the same thing: action, selector, reducer. If we look at the selectors, this get time zone is just a function. that takes all the state of the whole app and drills down to just the little piece that we want. And so this function is what's being called over in app.js, which let me get back over there. Yeah, so this little function right here is being called providing the time zone to this kind of global time object that is responsible for formatting dates. And so now it knows what the time zone the user wants to see the dates in.
James,
so,
can I pop a question?
Yeah, please do.
What's the logic behind the use selector?
Yeah, use selector is provided for us from this library called React Redux.
Yeah.
And it's basically let's see. It allows you to give it a function that is a selector. So it's kind of like this. And in this function you have state, and that state is the whole app state. And so once you're in here, you can do return state.view.time zone. And that's kind of the same exact thing as what's happening in this line.
So it's similar to the way that thunk is a helper function.
Yeah. In a thunk, you have that get state function.
Yeah, right.
Yep, very similar. It's just for selecting stuff off the state.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you got it. And this is part of that hooks API that React recently introduced. And you used to have to write these functions called map state to props is the way you used to do it. And you'll see we still do that in some places in the app, like viewer. Yeah, I think we still, let's see, or no, search results table. Yeah, so this used to be the way that you had to do things. You had to make this function that took the state, and then you had to return all the pieces of the state that you wanted your component to be aware of. And you see we're kind of doing the same thing, calling these selectors and giving them the state. And then do this magic function that injects them into the component you want, which in this case is the results table. But, which is, let's see, here's the results table. So now all those pieces of the state that you selected are in this props object. Yeah, that's how it used to be done. But now we can grab little bits of the state using use selector, and it's just a little cleaner, a little nicer API there.
And the same goes for dispatch to props. That's all legacy.
Yeah, the same for that. If you want to dispatch within a component now, all you need to do is call use dispatch, and then you're done. And let's see, that comes from the same package. And so now I can, if I wanted to, I could dispatch view.set time zone to Pacific or whatever a valid time zone is. But yeah, no need to call map state or map dispatch to props anymore. So as a result, you find that a lot of apps or a lot of components that use the that pick state off, or that select things off the state, they don't have any props anymore. Like, look at all these, no props, no props, no props, no props, no props. Because within each of those, they're just getting the state they need from things like this, like use selector. Okay, let me back it up a little bit. I guess we'll keep going with some of the directory structure. I mentioned these entry points. I'll talk about this Brim folder. In here, I started to put domain-specific data structures, like a log. So when I search the app and I see this line with all this data here, that's represented as a log in the app. And that's kind of wrapped up. And then if I wanted to get the UID field, I would call a function called like get field and then pass in UID as a name. And so that's what this little object does. So yeah, Brim is full of like domain-specific objects. Like here's an AST object where I can whenever I type in a search. Whoopsies, can't type. Path equal con. We take this string, we parse it into an AST, and then the AST is what we send to the backend to give us the search results that we want. And we have actually we have a little tool in here called debug query, where you can actually see the AST object here. So in the app, if we're dealing with this AST or dealing with having to parse a string into an AST, the AST class is what we use for that. So it's got some message like, is this a valid AST? Is this, give me some of the procs, give me the proc by name, give me the group by keys, stuff like that is in this object. So yeah, in Brim, little objects, little like helper objects like this, models, domain models, they go in Brim. You'll find some stuff that's not a domain model, that's more generic, and that should be in here. That should be in the lib folder. The lib folder is for things that are like not specific to Brim, but just useful helpers for any JavaScript project. So here's some functions to deal with dates. Here's some functions to deal with formatting into bytes and commas. But as you see here too, there is some Brim specific stuff like column order and connection history. So that doesn't belong there anymore. That belongs back up in Brim. Another place that you might find stuff is stdlib, standard lib, but that's deprecated too. All this code needs to be moved into the lib folder. But that's kind of the same idea, like functions just for manipulating objects or functions just for running commands. Yeah, we've changed our patterns a few times over the last 2.5 years or so, and so there is some old cruft in there. All right, flows. Okay, yeah, this is interesting. Flows, I tried to put all the business logic of the app into this flows directory. And there's no structure really. It's just kind of a flat list of files that represent different operations you can do in the app. And in order for something to be a flow, it's got to have some like logic to it. So it's got to, or there's a truck going by my street. But it's got to pull from the state, maybe do some conditional checks on that state, and dispatch different actions based on the state of things. So here's a nice one. This execute table search is what gets called when I hit enter in the app. So when I make a search here and I hit enter, what happens is I need to issue two searches. One search that populates the histogram here, and then another search that populates the table. And so the code that executes the table search lives here. The code that executes the histogram search lives in this file. And actually the file that calls them is called submit search. Maybe I need to start there. Submit search. So as soon as I hit enter, submit search is called, and it will check to see if my SQL is valid. It will save the search to the history. It will clear some things out, and then it will execute a table search and a histogram search, like that. So that's what flows is for. It's for kind of complex procedures where you need to grab lots of different pieces of the state, and depending on how things look, perform different actions, or do validation, or do async. Anything that's async probably belongs in a flow. So we've got things for deleting a space. When I right click and I click delete, let's see, I'll show you. I don't know if this is out yet, but I'm on master right now, and this is kind of the new left sidebar that we're working on.
Yeah, that's we're going to try to assemble a new release today. This will probably be GA'd shortly, but the current 12.0 release or 0.12 release does not have this yet, but this is coming. Yep.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, if I delete the space and I click that, then this function will be called. So we got downloading a PCAP. That's this function. Fetch the next page. So that gets called when I scroll down to the end of the table and it needs to load more. You can see, boom, it just loaded more, and now I'm brought up here. So that's what fetch next page means. It's like it's what's behind that infinite scroll. Ingest files, that one gets called when we drag something here, or if I choose some files here. Oh, that's a problem. Got some bad state on here. But when you drag and drop files or choose them there, this function's called. So this is a nice, looking at the flows folder actually is a really nice way to look at all the things that the app can do, and all the different operations that it wants to do. And Remy just contributed one where we are going to scroll to a page. So here's a function that scrolls to a log, and we grab some state, we figure out where we need to scroll to based on which log we want to scroll to, and then we dispatch this action. And that's useful when you're I'll just kind of show that off real quick. That's when, if I've got a filtered view, like I'm only looking at con logs, and then I'm scrolling and I find one that's interesting, I can right click on the timestamp and I could say view in full context, which will remove all my filters and just so I could see the list of all logs. But then it will zoom, it will also change my time span to a minute before this log and a minute after this log. And then it will scroll the viewer to this log to put it back at the top. So let me see if there we go. So it changed my time span to a minute before and a minute after, removed all my filters, and it scrolled me to that con log right there. So that's like a little flow. You know, that's the kind of stuff that belongs in a flow. Viewing a log detail, that goes in here. So whenever I so let's say I have the right pane open, which is the log details view. Whenever I click on a log to pull it up in the details, that's this view log detail is getting called there. Anyway, you got all sorts of stuff in here. Save the window state, show warnings, refresh the window, initialize the new tab. That, you know, that would get called when I click this plus button here. Yeah, this is a good spot for people curious about how things work to go in there. All right. The initializers, I can walk through that briefly. Whoopsies. What happens in here? So the main function is the initialize function. And so here's everything that needs to happen before we start up React. We need to initialize a store, which is that we create the Redux store in there. We add a couple divs to the DOM so that we can mount onto them. I set up some globals. I set up some cleanup listeners. IPC. This is an interesting piece here. Maybe I'll click into that. Like I said, the Electron has two processes, the main process and the renderer process. And in order to communicate between the two, you have to use this IPC inter-process communication module that Electron provides you. So what I'm doing here is this function is called in the renderer process. So I set up some listeners to listen for things that the main process might want to tell me. So we can click into that. So the main process might tell me, hey, pin the search bar. Pin the search to the search bar. And so then I dispatch that action. And focus the search bar. It might do that. And clear the pins, toggle the sidebar, reset the state, give me the state, show the preferences, and a number of other actions that the main process might want this browser window to perform. So if you're curious more about how that works, there's the this here, this main versus renderer process in Electron. That's kind of like the core architecture of Electron that is helpful to understand. And anything that's like native-y in the app, meaning it's not a website, is going to be has to be handled in the main process. So like you'll notice that Electron has this nice menu here that all Mac apps have, and all these actions, whenever I click them, those click handlers are defined in the main process. So if I want this window to respond to any of those things, I have to do it through the IPC module. And so, I mean, for example, if I if I have path equal con in my search box, and then I come up to query, and I click pin search. When I click this, the main process has to tell this browser window to pin the search, which is the equivalent of hitting this button here. So pin search, boom, now it's pinned. And what happened was the main process sent this pin search message to that browser window, and then we are able to update the app with that action. Yeah, so some other menu action listeners are here. That's this place is anytime we right click, you'll notice that it's a native context menu and not like a HTML fake context menu. That's all provided by Electron, and that also is all handled in the main process. So just like this top menu up here. So anytime I do filter equal value, and I'm changing the search bar with the right click menu, that also is inter-process communication happening. And I think we set up those listeners right in here. Yeah. And then this ZQD connection is the back end. So whenever you start up Brim, what we do is we start a background process, a background ZQD process running on localhost, which is basically the ZQ command as a service. And it has a REST API that you can hit, and every time we're issuing searches or creating spaces or ingesting, we are sending HTTP requests to this localhost 9867, and that's all written in Go, and provided as a binary that we bundle in with the Electron app.
Yeah, so for folks that there's a whole separate repo called ZQ, right, that has the Go code for the back end and the standalone ZQ CLI command. So subject of a different webinar perhaps, but if anyone's a Go developer who wants to get that kind of a tour, just let us know on Slack, and we'll line that up. But as James is saying, yeah, we depend on that for our backend services.
And just so I think that's in I think that the binary is in ZDEPs.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So it's get ignored. It happens. It gets installed whenever you run npm install automatically, but in this ZDEPs folder, it's kind of grayed out. But you can see ZQ is a command, ZQD is a command, and we have a Zeek runner that also comes bundled with the app. So 3 binaries that come bundled with Brim, and that are used to give you this whole Brim experience thing. All right.
Good time to pause for questions. Anyone have questions yet?
Yeah. Anything?
Yeah, I had one lingering one. If I look at viewer reducer.js and history reducer.js, they look very different in structure. And I think that's because viewer is using the Brim object heavily and history isn't, or vice versa. No,
so the
not
viewer
talking about the reducer, I think.
Viewer history reducer. Ah.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Okay. What's happening here? So reducers, they are just functions that that receive actions, and an action has a type. So depending on what action they receive, we do different things. But at the end of the day, they receive one version of the state, and then they return a new version of the state. And in this case, the state for this little reducer just looks like this. You have an entries array and a position number. And so whatever this function returns needs to basically be an object that looks like this, position and entries. And how you change this object is kind of up to you. So in viewer, you can see we just return an object literal every time. But in history, I think because it's not a trivial operation like this, changing this viewer is pretty simple. I'm just splicing records, or I'm just changing the status to something very similar, just assigning here. So it doesn't need to be complex, but if it becomes more complex, you can break this out into a function that returns the thing you want. So that's what's happening here is I'm just giving the state to this helper function, and then we're going to push this new entry into this entries array, and then data just returns an object that looks just like this. So I think I only did this to make it a little easier to read in this switch statement. It's just like a helper function, but at the end of the day, it receives this state parameter, changes it a little bit, and then returns the same shape object. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thanks.
Okay. No problem.
And James, while we're paused, I'm looking back at our agenda we posted. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of testing expectations if folks are submitting changes? What kind of tests we're hoping to see with?
Yeah, absolutely. Testing.
Oh, sorry if I made you skip ahead. I wasn't sure if you were...
I think no, that was the next thing on the list. So yeah, testing is provided by this. We have a Jest test runner, and to run those, you can just run npm run test, and all the unit tests will get run, and you can see where they live. But basically, when you run npm run test, it'll look through everything in the src.js folder that ends with test.js. So you can see all these files, they just have .test.js, .test.js, .test.js. So anything with that suffix will get picked up and run. And so we can look at one of those now. The place I put them is usually right next to the thing they test. And so like this field object has a test called field.test.js, and it just lives right next to it. And then we just write these test cases. And things like object models and domain models, these are pretty easy to test. There's no async anything happening. There's just input output that we're testing. And so there's a lot of tests in this folder because it's so easy to. But let's see, in other parts of the code, like components, there's not a lot of tests, and we don't have like a easy way of testing components. I mean, we do. We have a way to test components, but I think for me, there's just where's it at? Let's see, search. I think there's a search test. Let me see, components, test, search page test. Okay, so yeah, so here are some libraries that you need to do to set up a to test a component. When you test a component, you have to set up the Redux store. You have to mock out any async requests to ZQD, and you have to, if you're using any set timeouts or anything, you kind of have to mock the timers too. So there's just a lot more to mock for these types of tests, but you certainly can. You can render components and assert things. This test really just makes sure that it renders. I'm not even asserting anything. But thankfully, we've got this integration test suite that helps a lot with the UI, testing the actual UI interactions. So why don't I could talk about that real quick. At the top level at Brim, there's this iTest directory, which is the integration test, which, Mike B, are you on this call? Thought I saw you.
Yes, I am.
All right. So Mike has set up this iTest directory, and he's owned this piece of the code, and so he's got a nice README here about how to run them, and the code layout. He's got all this good stuff in here. That's awesome. So in these tests, these are more like browser integration tests that you might see in like a Selenium project, or and so, for example, pcaps.test, this is going to ingest pcaps, and let's see, you're gonna click this SSL cell, and then save a pcap. Make sure that the page has the words "download complete" somewhere on there. And so when you run this, I'm going to go ahead and do it. npm run iTest. You'll see the app pop up, and like a ghost typing stuff. So it's ingesting a pcap. It's going to issue some searches. It's going to do all this automation. I'm not touching anything. It's just kind of pulling up the app and making assertions. So that's kind of where we rely on testing the UI. I'm gonna get out of this now. So tests, I don't know, if you do write a test for a component, that's awesome, super great, can't hurt. But writing tests for I'll tell you where we do have good test coverage is in this state folder. So anything that messes, or all of these actions that mutate the state or select from the state, those all have pretty good tests, and it's pretty straightforward to test those. I've got this like test store that you can get that is just like a Redux store, and you can just dispatch actions to it. You can call get state on it, and make all the assertions that you want. So that's, anytime you change anything in the state folder, I'd expect that there'd be some tests updated or added. Yeah, and then, I mean, really after that, you've just got you got the state code, you've got like domain objects, which are easy to test also, and then you've got the flows, which the flows are a little trickier to test, but if it's a really critical flow, I will write tests for it. So like, I think we have a submit search test. So submit search is what happens when you hit enter, like I mentioned, and we've got some pretty, I guess, a nice list of, is this the test? There we go. Yeah, we got a nice list of, nice bit of tests here, issuing different types of searches and making sure things get done. But I really enjoy writing the tests with Jest. It's pretty straightforward. All you got to do to write a test is like make a new file with any name really, but I usually do the same name. Rename space .test.js. Boom, and now I'm ready. And all I have to do is test my my code and provide a function. This test function is global in all the tests, and then this expect function is also global. So I could expect 1 to equal 1, and now I've got a test, and it runs. Yeah.
Cool. Let's maybe do a quick time check. We got just under 10 minutes left. Does anyone have questions about testing or any other general questions at this point?
Yeah, I've got one general left. React DevTools, do they work in an Electron app?
Yeah, they do. Is Mason here? I don't think so, huh?
I do not see him on the call.
Okay, so they do work in an Electron app. I think I removed them, but I need to put them back. So you know, they usually you can get these developer tools in an Electron app by this view toggle developer tools, or just command option command I.
Just smash a bunch of keys at once and they'll come up.
Yeah. And Redux and React should appear here at the end. And the reason it's not is simply because I think it's commented out, which is just silly. But here it is. So this install extensions function, there it is. So I think if I just comment this back, I think, and then I add browser window. I think now, if I restart this, we'll have that. I don't know why. I think something was going slow, and I just decided I didn't need these dev tools to see if that was why it was slow. But I think the reason I said Mason is because I think he always has those available. But now if I click here, there it is. I've got Redux.
Ah.
And do I not have React? Okay, maybe a little bit more work for React to appear, but yeah, now I've got the Redux dev tools. More tools. Is that how that? More tools. Okay, well, I think something must be needed to add those, but you know, I've been meaning to put those back in, so that's a good to-do list from this call. That'll help people.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right, well, down to the last 5 minutes. Speak up if you have questions, or James, if there's any last things you want to cover. Ooh, migrations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess, yeah, I'll just briefly say that because we do save a file to the user's computer, so that when I quit Brim and then open it back up, it remembers my window positions and it remembers my history, my search history. We save that to a little JSON file, and so every time we change the state of the app, we have to be aware that a user might load up an old stale version of their state if they haven't updated the app recently. So we write data migrations anytime we change the shape of the Redux state. And there's a little tool we do to do that. And then I guess, yeah, here are some diverging patterns right now for styling. A lot of the style code is in SCSS. So in the source folder in here, SCSS. A lot of styles are here. The convention is whatever the name of the component you're styling is, just do the same name, but with dashes and lowercase. And so it just targets class names and adds style. But Mason has, or we both recently introduced this styled components library, which allows you to write CSS inside the JavaScript. And so we are, going forward, any new components are going to use that library. And we're going to see how we like that. And it seems to be pretty nice, pretty promising so far. I guess the last little thing is the client that we use to connect to ZQD to make all these API requests is a little bit in transition. We used to have our backend called Boom, and so we had a Boom client that would hit the API. But we now have ZQD as our backend, so we have a Zealot client that interacts with the backend. So everything in the app uses Zealot except for the search endpoint. So whenever you hit enter, we're still using the Boom client to connect to ZQD. And so that's in the transition right now, but pretty soon everything will use this Zealot client. And that's located in this services. Kind of looks like this, like here are all the endpoints you can hit. Spaces list, spaces get, spaces create, search, ingest logs, ingest pcaps. So all the interaction with the backend is contained in this folder. But yeah, with that, I think I kind of broad brushstrokes covered some of the stuff, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Brim Slack, and yeah, it's been exciting just to kind of see the more and more interaction with our open source users.
That's great stuff, James. Yeah, could you expand your browser window just so people can see the full URL of the wiki article?
You got it.
Yeah, so it's in the Brim wiki, this page, code base walkthrough. So yeah, this is the outline of everything that James has just covered. So yeah, if you all have questions, come talk to us on the Brim Slack, and if we have a lot more questions, we could always schedule another one of these. Or if you have people, if you or people you know are Go developers and want to know more about how the backend is put together, we could do one of those. So just speak up with your ideas, and we'll get more of these for you in the future. Any final questions from anyone before we adjourn? All right, sounds like we're satisfied. Well, thanks for everyone who could make it. This has been really helpful, James. I'm sure this archive will live on and answer questions for people in the future. So hello to the future. All right, well, thanks everyone. Come see us on Slack. Keep using Brim. Have a good day.
All right, thanks everybody.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.